beginnings that might as well be checked. At home she studied the matter carefully in a strong light, and called Rosalie, her maid, to aid her. The little Frenchwoman assured her that a microscope was needed to detect a white thread in that beautiful mass of dark nut brown. With a microscope, no doubt, as many as half a dozen might be discerned dimly, just where it waved back from mademoiselle's face. That same afternoon she and Rosalie left town for one of their country house visits. It was a weepy autumn day, and she was not as fresh as usual. The hairdresser, combined with some troublesome shopping, had tired her, and the disquieting suspicion laid hold of her that she was more easily fatigued than she used to be. While reading her novel in the train, she counted her years, and compared herself with the women she knew whose ages were recorded in the peerage, and who could therefore be proved to be as old as herself. Some of them were wrinkled hags, carelessness or ill health, doubtless, she reflected, and neither charge could be laid at her door. Hey ho, that horrid man! It was dark night when they reached the little station belonging to the mansion that was their goal. A dozen other guests and their servants and baggage crowded the platform, and half a dozen carriages and luggage brakes the yard behind, and Deb was at once in charge of a tall footman, Rosalie struggling through the press with jewel case and dressing bag, chattering French to one of her familiars in the rear. Distracted station master and porters uncovered to the stately woman as she passed. It was all a matter of course to her these days. She was too late for the big tea party. The men had gone to the smoking room, the women to their own firesides. After a brief but affectionate interview with her titled hostess, Deb was soon at hers, slippered and dressing gowned, sipped the jaded woman's stimulant, warming the damp and dismalness out of her, assuring herself confidently that she was not an old woman, and had no intention of becoming one. Certainly, when Rosalie had dressed her, she was entitled to an easy mind. The best of everything tonight, in vindication of her still unimpaired beauty and potency. Shimmering brocade of her favourite red, and lace like fairy work, and then the magnificent satin white breast and massive throat, and the stately head crowned with the famous 5 stars, whose flashing made the eye wink, and which yet were dimmed by the light of her dark eyes. She surveyed herself with full content when the last touch had been given her, and her slow sweep adown corridors and grand staircase was a triumphal march. She knew that her entrance into the crowd downstairs could not more fail of its customary effect than could the appearance of the sun next morning, or, one should rather say, the announcement of dinner to the tired and hungry shooting men. She was met at the foot of the grand staircase by her host, and immediately surrounded. In the close press of friends, she did not notice the strangers. Time was too short, and they were too many. A lord of her acquaintance, who still hoped to make her his lady, took her in to dinner, and called upon all her powers of wit and repartee to meet his conversational tactics during the meal. It was an exhilarating encounter, and of sufficient interest to keep her eyes in the boat. Moreover, the table was immense, and the chief of the strangers sitting on her side of it, a long way off. After dinner there was little comedietta played on the boards of the toy theatre belonging to the house. Many of the ladies were in their places before the men, still craving repose after their hard day's work, could hoist themselves from their chairs in the dining room. Deb, having helped to coach one of the amateur performers, was early in her seat in front. Some of her admirers did manage to squeeze in beside and behind her from time to time, but the particular stranger haughtily held aloof. Then, when the play was over, there was an impromptu dance, for the theatre was an annex to the ballroom. It was the young folk who began it, but older ladies joined in, and all the men but the hardened sportsmen, who saw a chance to sneak to their snuggery and gun talk before the time. The really old women, obviously past their dancing days, sat around, and looked on and gossiped to one another, and for a time Deb sat with them. She was certainly tired, for her, and the fact struck her that she had not danced for a long time. She had shirked balls, having only too many entertainments to choose from. She thought it likely that she would be stiff and heavy on her feet from want of practice, a horrible idea to her, who had once danced like a feather in the wind. A good stone had been added to her weight since she had last waltzed with satisfaction to herself. That also was not a pleasing thought. So when her dinner lord essayed to entice her, she shook her head. A dozen other men, and the cream of them too, there was comfort in that, followed his example, and made her charming compliments when she said laughingly that she was too old for those frivolities. Too old! Gracious heavens! They apostrophised space. It was heart-warming to hear them. But they went off easily, and were soon dancing with the young girls, sylphs as airy and agile as she had once been. And by degrees she drew apart from the old ladies and their talk, which she hated to seem, even to herself, to belong to, and presently found herself in the extraordinary position of sitting alone. She leaned back in her chair, and with eyes half shut, looked at the whirling couples, and dreamed of the days, the dances, the youth that were no more. She saw, not this splendid saloon, but a shabby small room in an old bush house, the walls not panelled with paintings by R.A.'s, and starred with clusters of electric lights, but with wreaths of homely evergreens and smelly kerosene lamps. And amid the happy throng that jostled for room to dance there, a young girl and a young man, newly betrothed, anticipating an immortal paradise in each other's arms. And she looked up, and saw Claud Dalzell watching her. He was horribly aged, illness, it seemed, and had grown quite white. That splendid lover with whom she had danced, as no girl here knew how to dance, in the golden prime of everything. Their eyes met, and there must have been in both pairs something that neither of them had seen before. He crossed to her side at once, and she did not freeze him when he got there. "How do you do? I have been wondering if you were going to recognise me." "How do you do? I didn't know you were here. I never saw you until this moment. I have been standing there for 10 minutes. I did not notice. I was thinking." "You were, deeply. I was trying to guess what you were thinking of." "I wonder, did you? I wonder, was it, by any chance," he dropped his voice, "Five Creeks?" She was quite startled and discomposed by this extraordinary divination. Having no time to decide how she would take it, she filled the embarrassed moment with a laugh. "Goodness! I'd no idea that my face was such a telltale. I believe I was. That funny old room, with ridges in the floor, and the ceiling nearly on your head. How did we manage to dance in it?" "Well, we did manage somehow, didn't we?" They gazed at the figures wheeling past them, blankly unresponsive to casual stares and smiles. they seemed to hear the rotten floodgates shut so